Britain and other European countries are filled with memorials dedicated to what their creators termed the Great War. Often, later editions, whether by towns, universities, or other institutions, list names of those lost between 1939 and 1945. A glance at these monuments reveals a stark disparity. Far more names appear for the First World War than the Second. However, these lists reflect only military deaths, those killed in combat. What distinguished World War II, making it exponentially worse, was the slaughter of millions of civilians. They perished in bombing raids, in deliberate acts of genocide, and through methods of destruction that were unimaginable prior to 1939.
We scroll back to the 30 Years'
Survivors
War,
of what we now know as World War I fervently believed it was the war to end all wars, the final conflict on such a catastrophic scale. For people living in the 1920s and 1930s, the atrocities that lay ahead were simply beyond conception. Remembering this context is vital. As Billy Wilder famously remarked, hindsight is always 20/20. We understandably view the interwar period, 1919 to 1939, through the lens of the 6 disastrous years that followed. World War II was a conflict of unprecedented scale. It was truly global, with a death toll exceeding 55 million. A figure that would have been unfathomable to the generation that survived the Great War. In terms of civilian casualties, the only historical precedent is the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648. Regarding sheer ferocity, perhaps only the savagery of the Mongol hordes under Genghis Khan compares to the barbarity exhibited by the Japanese and Germans between 1937 and 1945. Yet, in the 1920s and 30s, those Mongol invasions were ancient history, far removed from modern reality. Consequently, it is easy to be wise after the fact. This is rarely more evident than when discussing World War II. We often ask ourselves, given the horrors of the Holocaust, how could people fail to heed Churchill's warnings? The systematic murder of nearly 6 million innocent Jewish civilians has become the defining symbol of barbarism, not only for that conflict, but arguably for all of human history. Regrettably, post-war events have politicized the Holocaust, linking it to modern geopolitics. As a result, these deaths are viewed through the prism of the State of Israel rather than as a singular human tragedy. Furthermore, other genocides have since gained recognition, including the murder of over 1 million Armenians during World War I and the deaths of tens of millions of Soviet citizens in World War II. Sadly, the focus on the Jewish Holocaust has shifted into a debate over whether these victims have a greater right to remembrance than slaughtered Armenians or Poles. This is deeply unfortunate. The murder of 6 million innocent civilians remains a tragedy in its own right, regardless of the fact that other equally blameless groups also suffered at the hands of the Nazis. Moreover, the Holocaust, often referred to as the Hebrew term Shoah, unfolded in distinct phases. Not all victims perished in extermination camps. Historians distinguish between the Shoah by bullet and the Shoah by gas. Before the gas chambers, German SS Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing squads, shot over 1 million Jews in cold blood. The most infamous massacre occurred in September 1941 at Babi Yar, near Kiev, where 33,000 Jews were butchered. While the precise timing and decision-making behind the Holocaust remain debated, the plan to murder all 11 million Jews in Europe appears to have solidified in late 1941, when a successful invasion of the USSR briefly seemed imminent. Concentration camps for political prisoners, such as socialists and other anti-Nazi groups, had existed since 1933. Following the conquest of Poland in 1939, Jews were confined to ghettos in cities like Warsaw and Krakow. However, as this created logistical issues for the occupiers, the policy shifted towards total extermination. Dedicated extermination camps such as Treblinka and Auschwitz-Birkenau were constructed starting in 1941, featuring gas chambers designed for industrial-scale killing. This policy was formalized in January 1942 at a villa in Wannsee, Berlin. Presided over by SS General Reinhard Heydrich, the meeting included diplomats and bureaucrats for whom the racially motivated murder of millions was merely an administrative matter. Ultimately, over 1 million Jews died at Auschwitz-Birkenau and approximately 800,000 at Treblinka. Was the Holocaust unique? A review of Hitler's Mein Kampf and Nazi rhetoric suggests that anti-Semitism was intrinsic to their ideology. This drive to eliminate an entire ethnic and religious group parallels their desire to exterminate other perceived undesirables, such as the disabled and the mentally ill. However, anti-Semitism was not unique to Germany. It permeated many European fascist movements. The massacre of over 50,000 Jews in Odessa by Romanian troops in October 1941 demonstrates that such barbarity was shared. Indeed, the pre-war Romanian League of the Archangel was as violently anti-Semitic as the Nazi Party. Furthermore, many enthusiastic SS guards were Latvian or Ukrainian. Anti-Semitism was an ancient pan-European phenomenon, not solely a Germanic evil. It is this specific quality of horror that renders the Shoah unique. While tens of millions of civilians of various nationalities were butchered during World War II, only the Jews were singled out for total extermination based on state policy and ideological hatred. Many argue that Churchill was vindicated in his opposition to appeasement during the 1930s, especially given events like the German seizure of Czechoslovakia in 1939. However, contemporary perspectives differed. This is illustrated by a conversation shortly before D-Day between a U.S. official and General Ismay, Churchill's chief of staff. When the Americans expressed concern over a perceived lack of British aggression regarding the invasion of Europe, Ismay defended his country's caution by citing the 57,000 British casualties suffered on the first day of the Somme in 1916. The psychological scar left by that experience was profound. In retrospect, Britain would have fared better with a significantly larger army in 1939. Crucially, even Churchill first failed to grasp this. Military historians like Richard Holmes and Gordon Corrigan note that the army was undersized. While Churchill correctly advocated for expanding the Royal Air Force, which narrowly saved Britain in 1940, he and others underestimated the need for ground forces. To fight a modern continental war, one requires soldiers and specific equipment. Between 1938 and 1940, Britain arguably lacked both the troop numbers and the necessary weaponry to engage effectively on the continent. The British Chiefs of Staff, representing the Army, Navy, and Royal Air Force, instinctively grasped these military deficiencies. However, they were answerable to politicians who, in a democracy, had to remain sensitive to the electorate. The defining factor of the era was the trauma of the Great War. The public had no appetite for another conflict of such magnitude. Consequently, Churchill was not merely a lone voice criticizing the blindness of lesser statesmen. He was swimming against the overwhelming tide of public opinion, not only in Britain, but in key Dominion nations like Canada and Australia. Moreover, Britain was as much an Asian power as a European one. Until the 1970s, the country maintained a full naval fleet in Singapore to patrol the Pacific and protect colonial interests in what is now Malaysia. Yet, the jewel in the crown was the British Raj, comprising modern-day India, Pakistan, and later Bangladesh. This immense, wealthy empire was the focal point of all strategic calculations made by the British government and its military planners. The events of 1919 to 1939 must be viewed through this imperial and psychological lens. The generals of World War II were the junior officers of World War I. It is arguable that after the horrors of Flanders, they carried a form of survivor guilt. As Max Hastings frequently notes, the British are not inherently martial people. The slogan, "Never Again," was a potent rallying cry that echoed throughout the interwar period.
The primary result of this sentiment was the dismantling of the victorious British Army after 1919, which severely degraded the nation's fighting capacity. Historically, Britain had always been a naval power, and we can be thankful that the Royal Navy remained strong enough in 1939 to protect the home islands. The massive continental deployment of conscripts during World War I was viewed as a historical anomaly. Once victory was achieved, the Army reverted to its traditional role as an instrument of colonial policing. Despite Britain playing a key role in inventing the tank, the military establishment treated the Great War as an aberration, never to be repeated. Across the Atlantic, the United States famously retreated into isolationism. Less well known is the fact that as late as 1940, the U.S. Army was roughly the size of Belgium's. Despite its economic power, the USA was a military lightweight during the interwar period. To many isolationist Americans, the very concept of a large peacetime standing army was abhorrent. The depth of this sentiment is illustrated by the fact that even in November 1940, well into the war against Hitler, President Roosevelt was forced to campaign on a platform of neutrality to retain the White House. With the benefit of hindsight, specifically looking back from 1945, it seems doubtful that much could have been done to stop Hitler and Japan early enough to prevent the conflict
This line
entirely.
secures the main objective for Mussolini.
However, that
Let us
is
hope
not
the
how
press does not find
contemporaries
out.
saw the situation. It was not until Hitler seized the remainder of Czechoslovakia in March 1939 that the majority of British and Dominion citizens accepted that war might be necessary, let alone inevitable. Even today, some contrarian voices argue that isolation from Europe would have been the superior option, despite the known barbarity of the Third Reich. Another factor clouding the origins of World War II was the widespread belief in the West that Germany had been mistreated in 1919. While Germany's punishment was light compared to the total destruction it suffered in 1945, the perception in the 1920s and 30s was different. Reparations were viewed as unjust, particularly because they were predicated on the idea that Germany alone started the war in 1914, a simplistic interpretation many rejected. Furthermore, because U.S. President Woodrow Wilson had championed self-determination, it seemed unfair that this right was denied to Germans. For instance, Austria was forbidden from uniting with Germany, a prohibition that contradicted the rights granted to Poles and Czechs. Consequently, when Hitler railed against the diktat of Versailles, many in the West felt his demands for renegotiation were reasonable.
Peace in our time.
A major historical debate of the 1960s questioned whether the Third Reich was simply a continuation of the German nation-state or something uniquely evil. While we now recognize the Nazi regime as wholly undeserving of sympathy, we must remember that in the 1920s and under Gustav Stresemann, Germany appeared to be rehabilitating itself. Stresemann even won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1926, and when Germany signed the Kellogg-Briand Pact in 1928, renouncing war, peace seemed secure. That same year, the Nazis were a fringe party, winning only 2.6% of the vote. We must also recall that Japan and Italy had been allies of Britain and the US during World War I. The Great Depression changed everything. By September 1930, the Nazi vote surged to 18.25%, and they peaked at 37.27% in July 1932. It is often forgotten, however, that their support actually dipped to 33.09% in November 1932. Hitler's appointment as Chancellor in January 1933 stands as one of the greatest political miscalculations in history. Conservative politicians appointed him, believing they could use him as a puppet. It is crucial to note that the Nazis were a major force, but Hitler was never elected to power by a democratic majority. Once in office, however, he consolidated his position. By 1934, he had secured the presidency and the loyalty of the Wehrmacht by purging his own paramilitary force, the SA, or stormtroopers, which the army had viewed as a threat to its authority. Much of the debate regarding the origins of World War II centers on the three revisionist powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan. These nations sought to revise the global settlement established in Paris after 1919. Historically, this focus is valid, as each nation harbored specific grievances they felt the democracies had failed to address. It is also worth noting that by the 1930s, any semblance of democracy had vanished in Italy and was increasingly fragile in Japan, as the army and navy consolidated their political power. For Japan and Italy, the shift from being allied partners in 1919 to revisionist aggressors in the 1930s was driven largely by a desire for imperial expansion. Here, one must acknowledge that the Western democracies were guilty of a clear double standard. While modern perspectives rightly condemn colonialism and its racist underpinnings, the geopolitical reality of the 19th century was defined by the scramble for Africa, during which Britain, France, and Germany carved up the continent. These acquisitions, added to earlier holdings by the British, Dutch, and French, created vast European empires across Asia. In the 21st century, many would argue that the British conquest of India was not fundamentally different from Japan's desire to colonize Manchuria, and after 1937, the rest of China. What logically distinguishes Britain's conquest of modern-day Nigeria in the 1890s from Mussolini's invasion of Ethiopia 4 decades later? Today, we view all such acts as morally wrong. Yet in the 1930s, Churchill found himself in the contradictory position of zealously defending British rule in India while simultaneously denouncing German imperial ambitions in Europe. When Japan launched its campaigns of conquest in 1941, it seized territories that were effectively Asian nations ruled by Europeans. This irony was lost on many in the West, but certainly not on the indigenous populations who merely exchanged one foreign ruler for another. While we now criticize all such imperialism, the situation in the 1930s was complex. Ultimately, the large-scale brutality of the Japanese occupation proved to millions of Asians that their new masters were far more repressive than the light-touch Europeans had been. Italy, however, presents a different case. Mussolini did not militarily ally with Hitler until the fall of France. The appeasement of Italy, while morally reprehensible, was a strategic policy that very nearly succeeded in keeping the dictators apart. However, accommodating Hitler, despite the surface plausibility of his cause to reunite all ethnic Germans, was a different matter entirely. The policy of the democracies toward Germany must be viewed in a separate category, because the true nature of the Nazi regime was evident from the start. Mussolini may have been a tyrant, but nothing in fascist Italy compared to the concentration camps established at the dawn of the Third Reich, or the state-sanctioned murder of the SA leadership in 1934. In that purge, known as the Night of the Long Knives, Hitler colluded with the army to eliminate Ernst Röhm and his stormtroopers, who were perceived as a rival power center. Even without the benefit of hindsight, it should have been apparent that Nazi Germany operated on a scale of brutality far exceeding Italian fascism.
Nevertheless, the democracies had demilitarized extensively in the 1920s, confident that industrial-scale warfare was a thing of the past. By the time Hitler assumed power in 1933, the global economy had collapsed. The prosperity required to rebuild vast armies, navies, and air forces was simply non-existent.
Furthermore, pacifism was deeply ingrained in the Western electorate, as nearly every family had lost a father, brother, or friend in the First World War. It is also crucial to remember that the political left, while resolutely anti-fascist, was equally opposed to rearmament. Instead, they placed their faith in the supposed strength of the League of Nations. This organization, born of Wilsonian idealism, was unfortunately a paper tiger.
So it is
Ironically,
agreed,
the United
the
States never
Sudetenland
joined,
will be ceded.
retreating from both European and global power politics.
Peace in our time.
Germany was admitted in 1926, but withdrew immediately upon Hitler's rise to power, and the USSR did not join until 1934. While opposing Hitler was morally right, doing so without weapons and relying on a toothless league meant that effective opposition to the Nazi threat was, for all intents and purposes, non-existent. When analyzing the unexpected fall of France in 1940, one must not overlook the profound suspicion of communism among Western Europe's ruling classes, and likely those in the USA. Although communist revolutions in Germany and Hungary had failed in 1919, they had terrified the European elite. Whatever Hitler, Mussolini, or Franco were, they were not communists. This fear distorted perceptions of Nazi Germany, blinding many to the unique threat Hitler posed until the countdown to war began in earnest in 1938. Ultimately, the post-war settlement of Versailles was undermined not only by the revisionist powers, but also by its key signatories, Britain, France, and Italy. Most historians, echoing Winston Churchill, believe the last opportunity for Western governments to stop Hitler and thereby prevent the Second World War was in March 1936. At that time, German troops reoccupied the Rhineland, a border area specifically demilitarized by the Treaty of Versailles. The traditional argument suggests that had the democracies halted Hitler then, the catastrophe that began in 1939 might have been averted. However, Hitler was not only occupying indisputably German territory, a point the appeasers would later emphasize, but he was also doing so with a newly expanded army, the Wehrmacht. Arguably, the true betrayal occurred in 1935, a year before the Rhineland crisis. To fulfill his expansionist plans, Hitler needed an army, an effective air force, the Luftwaffe, and submarine fleet, U-boats, not to mention tanks, Panzer. All of these were expressly forbidden by Versailles. Without them, the conquests of 1940 and 1941 would have been impossible. In March 1935, Hitler publicly renounced these restrictions. France and Britain were fully entitled to demand a reversal of this decision, yet they did nothing. Instead, in April 1935, Britain and France met with Mussolini in the Italian town of Stresa. The resulting Stresa Front was not a binding military alliance, but signaled the shared anxiety of the World War I allies regarding the rise of Nazi Germany. Italy, having gained the ethnically German territory of South Tyrol in 1919, had its own reasons to fear Hitler's desire to reclaim German lands for the Third Reich.